My friends and I back in college would not necessarily call ourselves ghost hunters, but we liked to go out into the woods at night and find old abandoned houses, graveyards and the like, which are plentiful when you live in the middle of nowhere. A common place for us to go was a park, which is very far into the woods and had an old covered bridge that was supposedly haunted. As an explanation as to why this bridge seems so scary, there is a light at the end of the bridge, and the shadows from the trees form to what look to be a figure. When you sit in the middle of the bridge, the wind makes the figure look like it's moving towards you. To the unsuspecting visitor, this can be a frightening experience, so we like to take our friends here to freak them out. To set the scene, it was late summer on a Wednesday night, probably around 2 a.m. We were all on summer break and had nothing going on, so we decided to take a couple of people down to the bridge to give them a good scare. This area is not easy to get to. There are a lot of steep hills and rocky roads. It is very secluded. So, as expected, there were no other cars on the road. We got down to the bridge, as we had so many other times before. It was tough to see the light at the end, but there were definitely plenty of shadows around, so the scare factor was still pretty high. So, as you're supposed to, we parked our car in the middle of the covered bridge and turned our lights off as well as our engine. Immediately, the people we brought with us showed the shadow figure approaching our car. We obviously tried to play it up and act like we saw it coming towards us. We continued to scare them, but something was wrong the whole time. The figure seemed a lot more lifelike, not like a tree swaying in the wind. It didn't feel like an illusion at all. I looked over at my friends and could tell that they noticed something was different this time too. It was at this point that I noticed that we were no longer looking at the same shadow figure at the end of the bridge. This one had actually moved directly in front of our car. In a panic, I turned on the headlights because it was becoming a bit too real. Once the lights came on, the figure did not disappear, and it did not stop inching towards our car. There in front of our car was a person in an all-black hoodie and all-black pants, hoodie over his head looking down at the ground. After the lights came on, he kept inching towards the car at a snail's pace. A prank, I thought. Someone saw us come down and was familiar with the story and wanted to mess with us. We opened our windows and yelled, "Hey, you got us pretty good." He had no reaction. Thinking he was just trying to stay in character, we laughed it off and backed out of the bridge and began heading back up the hill. There was a parking lot up at the top of the hill, still pretty deep into the woods. Maybe a minute or two drive from the bridge. We decided to head up that way to gather our thoughts and sort of process everything that had happened, since adrenaline was still running pretty high. We got to the parking lot, which is normally about a quarter full on a busy weekend during midday, with hikers, as it was a pretty popular hiking spot in the area. But 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, this place should have been totally empty. Upon pulling in, every spot was full. Considering the park closed at dusk, this was a disturbing discovery. We parked in the middle of the lot, trying to figure out what was going on. I grew up just minutes from the area, and the amount of cars in the lot was probably the equivalent of the nearest town's population. We sat in the lot for 5 to 10 minutes, just talking to each other, trying to figure out what was going on, when 2 German shepherds came running down the hill. They stopped at our car briefly, and then continued running off into the woods. The girl that we had brought with us had a look of horror on her face, and told us that we needed to leave. Confused and a bit concerned, I agreed and left the area quickly. She put everything together and said that cult activity in the area around us was very high. German shepherds are commonly an animal they use for sacrifices. I don't know where she got this information from, but all I know is that it has been about 5 years. I never saw her again, and I never went back to the bridge after that night. My father stopped going to the Creation Museum's church after he approached the pastor and asked why he and my brother were not allowed to have communion. The pastor told him, "I understand your concern, but we feel that since we don't know how good of a Christian you are, you and your sons should not be allowed to partake in communion, as it may contaminate innocence with your sins." They also demanded a huge amount of tithe and insisted at the time that any church others than theirs may not always be true Christians, and that going to churches other than theirs was wrong. They also insisted that people attending the church should also visit the Creation Museum, and if you questioned anything in it, it was sinful. They also told my dad and brother that unbaptized children shouldn't be near baptized children, presumably from the same contamination reason. We were just talking about it the night before last, and my father said, "I swear to you that's a cult in the making, and we haven't been there since." Also, my cousin was involved in the Mars Hill Church in Seattle. He was involved with a girl for over 2 years and planning to marry her. Eventually, they decided to sleep together. This was outrageously frowned upon at Mars Hill, and afterwards, the girl went to the Mars Hill pastor and told him that she and my cousin had had relations out of wedlock. Cue Mars Hill pastor bringing my cousin to the front of the church in front of the entire church body and publicly humiliating him, telling him he'd go to hell. The girl was forbidden from ever even being in the same room as him and has refused to speak to him since. My cousin tried to defend himself, and they started publicly and privately harassing him. People even going as far to harass him in public places like coffee shops or grocery stores. Eventually, Mars Hill did a public apology to my cousin, and my cousin left the country entirely, and now lives in Australia as a raging atheist and racist, dating a girl nobody in our entire family likes. My aunt and uncle, who he had been staying with in Seattle at the time, are prominent figures in Seattle, and while my aunt is a Buddhist and my uncle occasionally visit Mars Hill, they tried to get the pastor to apologize more appropriately, and he refused, telling my uncle it didn't matter anymore because my cousin made his choice. A couple of years later, the pastor and his wife had a sleep-in or whatever, where they spent all day in bed on the roof of the church to display how a truly loving couple should be, and my aunt and uncle were pretty pissed. I swear up and down Mars Hill is a cult, and that the pastor is the worst person in Seattle. I can guarantee God disapproves of him. I was staying at my friend's place a couple of years ago. I was in my early teenage years at the time. We got bored and decided to go on what my friend called a drainage ditch adventure. Little did we expect this drainage ditch adventure to devolve into what really happened. The sun was low in the sky on a cool fall evening, as I and several of my closest friends exited anonymous friend's house number 1 and headed down the street and through a small thicket of woods to where he knew the ditch was. When we arrived at the tunnel, we had to scale a fence separating the patch of woods and all of the suburban houses from the actual drainage. The ditch had a concrete barrier lining the bottom of it, so it was relatively easy to traverse. After that, it was almost like a road, which I could see spanned for a considerable distance, despite being overgrown by trees in some portions. After another small amount of time travelling along the ditch, we reached the tunnel, at which point a hill overlapped it, with more overgrowth hanging down. We walked into the tunnel using our phone's flashlight feature in order to see the quickly darkening environment. Not too far into the tunnel, graffiti became immediately clear on the walls, along with a number of spider webs. However, upon further inspection of the graffiti, we realized that this was no regular graffiti at all, rather unintelligible writing and occult symbols, such as pentagrams, and they were written across the wall, becoming more and more disturbing as we progressed deeper into the tunnel. As we went further into the tunnel, both my friends and I noticed a low-pitched humming coming from the depths within the tunnel. At first, the noise was barely noticeable, but as we progressed deeper, it became audibly louder. By now, we were thoroughly creeped out and convinced something strange was happening. But before we turned back of our own accord, I noticed and pointed out, to the others' dismay, a pair of two glowing dots that had suddenly appeared next to one another, deeper in the tunnel. It was at this point we all agreed to get the hell out, but not before I snapped some pictures on my phone of the writing and symbols on the wall. However, for whatever reason, I must have deleted these at some point later, as I can't find them anywhere. Perhaps I was feeling self-conscious about the possibility of people finding the photos and thinking I might have something to do with the cult. We arrived home unscathed, but with a very interesting story. My story began in March of 2017. I am a 19-year-old male. My family and I moved to this new house around that time. I was really excited because this house was huge and I got a beautiful garden with a pool and a hot tub. I'm not bragging, but this information will be important later. When we moved in, the real estate agent told my parents and me that there have been a series of home invasions in our street, and that our house and our neighbor's house were the only ones which they hadn't broken into yet. The first weird things started to happen in May of 2017. My room is at the patio, so when I look out to my garden, I can see the patio and the hot tub. At first, I could hear the gate of our garden being opened at night. That was continuing for the next 10 weeks. Sometimes we would go outside in the morning and all the lamps would be bashed in. Yes, 10 weeks in, like this property is haunted by a poltergeist, since we hadn't seen anyone doing it. At first, we thought it was some burglars, and that they were opening our garden gate at night because every morning my parents opened the patio door so that our dog can pee, while one of my parents would get dressed to go for a morning walk. So I guess the burglars were hoping for our dog to run off so they would have it easy to enter our home. All these incidents made me and my mum feel really unsafe in our own home. All of a sudden it stopped, and we thought that the person/people who did this had moved on or got bored. But after 5 months, everything started all over again, but worse. In November, I woke up to footsteps outside my window, so I opened my eyes and wished I wouldn't have done that. At that moment I was so scared. I saw a man of 6'3" standing outside my window watching me sleep. He looked so old yet so young. He had a young face, but a haircut that aged him 25 years. At least, that's what I could see in the dark. I was frozen. I couldn't move, so we just looked at each other in the eyes for what felt like an eternity. Suddenly, he ran off, so I took my chance and ran to my parents' room and told them everything. My dad grabbed his gun, which he was keeping at home now because he was worried over the past few months, as he's a police officer. He ran outside but couldn't find the man, but only a broken gate, so he called the police. The police, 2 of his colleagues actually, came but they couldn't do much, so they left rather promptly. 2 months later, I woke up to a splashing sound. I look out my window and noticed the sound was coming from the pool, but I couldn't see it due to trees blocking my way. So I shrugged it off because I thought there's just something wrong with the pump, which wasn't a rare thing. So I went back to bed. But I had a hard time falling asleep since the sound grew louder and more intense. So I got up and went into the living room, which allowed me to see the entire garden. When I looked outside, I got the same feeling which I had 2 months ago when I spotted the guy outside my window. Anyway, so I looked outside and saw the same man standing in our pool, draining our pool with a small cup. And I mean it how I said it. He was standing in our pool with a cup, throwing the pool water on the grass. He had this dead stare in his eyes, like he didn't even know what he was doing. He noticed me watching him and just smiled at me while diving down, like that's his way to escape. I woke up my dad, who immediately called the police. They left as fast as they came since they didn't find anything but an empty pool. They said he was probably homeless and was just washing himself, but I'm certain that's not what he was doing. As of now, August 2018, I noticed some strange cars standing in front of our house lately, and if someone would spot them, they'd drive off. My parents left me alone this weekend since it's my uncle's birthday. I didn't want to go, so I decided to stay at home. I got bored all alone at this big house, so I called a few friends of mine to come and hang out at my place. They came at around 7 p.m, and we started drinking some wine and listening to music. Time passes, and it was around 11 p.m. when we heard someone knocking at the window of our living room. I thought I was imagining the knocks, but my friend looked at me like they were about to ask if I was expecting someone. I turned off the music to listen, but all we heard was silence. I turned on the patio lights when a girlfriend of mine yelled, "Hey, there's someone running." I didn't see someone, but I heard the gate slam shut. I was worried, but decided not to call the police since they couldn't do anything anyway. I was really glad that my friends drank something and had a crash at my place so that I wouldn't be alone that night. The next day, my friends left at around 5 p.m. I was in my room when I heard something fall in my bathroom, so I got up to see what it was. When I walked towards the bathroom, I saw a person right behind the door. The person didn't notice I spotted him, so I walked back into my room to get my phone to call the police and parents. I wanted to go down to the den because my lock on my door was broken. When I passed the bathroom, I saw the person was still there, so I opened my camera and took a picture as proof for friends and family. When I took the photo, I didn't think to turn on the flash when I took the image, and it illuminated the entire bathroom, and the door slammed shut. I thought that was my chance to abandon the house completely, so I ran right out my house and called the police. They were there in 10 minutes. They went inside and came out with the same man who was terrorizing me and my family for over a year and a half now, naked. The police said he was just sitting in our bathtub, just staring at the drain. He was constantly saying, "The cult elder will eliminate you." Right now, I'm sitting here in my room writing this story. I'm worrying about the cult he was talking about. Are the suspicious cars in front of my house part of the cult? Or was he just an insane man? This entire event doesn't make sense to me, and I don't know what is yet to come, but my family and I are now going to move again in December. I am an 18-year-old female. My mother, sister, and I were shopping in our local Target. As we stroll around, I recognize a girl named Stacy, who is the same age as me. I used to go to school with her. For reference, I dropped out of high school my senior year, so I haven't been in my old high school or seen anyone from there for about a year now. I simply glance at her and keep on moving, doubting that she recognized me. because I haven't been in school for a year. A few minutes later, I'm on the complete opposite side of the store when I see this girl again. Like last time, our eyes awkwardly met, and I tried to just walk past her. But this time, she actually said something. "Hey, didn't we play tennis together?" Stacy spoke with wide eyes and a painfully large smile. There was a girl standing next to her, but I didn't recognize her. I simply replied a yes in response. I was never friends with her at school. In fact, I never talked to her or even liked her. That's when she introduced herself, as if I completely forgot who she was. She goes on to question if I still went to high school, in which I explained that I graduated early with online classes. The conversation started out normal. I thought it was simply us catching up, due to the fact that I had been absent from school. I wanted to keep cutting the conversation short, but Stacy kept prodding about what I was doing now, if I'm in college, and what college was like. They were harmless questions, and I didn't even mind answering them. But then the conversation took an unexpected twist. Stacy somehow weaseled the conversation into one about God and Christianity. For reference, I do consider myself a Christian, but not one of those hardcore ones who are constantly spewing Bible quotes at strangers. She asks if I attend church, to which I respond with yes. Her eyes become wider still, and her smile bigger. Her whole mantra of God sounded like this. Back in my high school days, I was always partying and being so happy, but that was all fake, and no one knew that I was actually pretty sad. That's when I found this church that showed me God's way and His undying love. He accepted me, and He'll accept you too. Now I'm always happy, for I have God on my side. And at this church, God truly appears before your very eyes. He cured me of all my physical and mental ailments, like when I messed up my knee in tennis. The whole time Stacy spoke, there was just a robotic tone about it, as if these words were memorized, practiced, and rehearsed. There was almost no genuine emotion in her, just wide eyes and a never-failing smile. Then her friend, Ashley, who was in her late teens or early 20s, began to speak. Keep in mind, my mother and sister are just an aisle away, waiting on me. Ashley's speech went like this. For a while in life, I suffered with depression and suicide. I was always faking to be happy until I found this church. It truly opened my eyes and heart. I no longer feel dead inside. This is when she hinted that maybe I feel dead inside too, and that the only way to recover from it is to look to God. Ashley also used the word zombie to describe this dead feeling, and that's when I began to think that there was something wrong with these girls. Ashley continued on saying, I don't think it's a mere coincidence that we ran into you. God led me to you. He wanted me to reveal to you the way. God put a vision in my mind of you opening a present, and that present is our Lord and Savior. She kept on ranting how this is destiny, that we had met, and that God put Stacy and Ashley in my path to reveal Himself to me. When Ashley mentioned depression and suicide, I could not help but to believe her for a slight second. I had been struggling with depression for years, but kept it quiet. And with me being a believer in God, I was almost fooled into thinking that this was a sign telling me to finally open up and get help. But when Ashley began to ramble about her church, that foolish hope dissipated quickly. Then the two moved the conversation onto their own church. They kept stating that it was not a normal church, and that God Himself in flesh and blood came to listen to them. They informed me that God had come to heal them of misery and grief. She then pulled out a business card which had the church's email, a Bible quote, and her personal phone number before the anticipated departure. They kept saying how cool I am and that they're glad they'd met me, and then we finally parted ways. I remember my legs being extremely weak when I walked away. That's when in my mind it clicked. Are they part of some cult? Their mannerisms and behavior seemed too scripted to be real. That's when my sister found me and answered my suspicions. Apparently, before I had to endure that 10-minute chat with Stacy and Ashley, my sister overheard the girls were having the same conversation with another girl on the opposite side of the store. So this was all scripted, and it was their way of luring and persuading strangers to join their church. I realize now how they do it. To reel me into their discussion, they discussed about my absence from school and my experience in college. To reel in the other girls, they talked about complimenting their outfit and inquiring about her artistic hobbies. I wondered how many people they ended up talking to, and if they were just walking around the store, hoping to find easy targets to interact. I have so many questions, and that's what bothers me the most about this. And being the somewhat religious person that I am, I feel their talks of God unnerved me. It is sort of humorous to think of now, simply because I think crazy God lovers are comical, but I am still bewildered. If you have any information about how cults operate and how they coax people into joining them, please let me know. Does this incident sound like cult members trying to spread their message? Or harmless teenage girls trying to spread the love of God? I wish I knew. I hope I don't see Stacy again, but I might, as she's attending my college next semester. I hope we never meet again. I accidentally was in a religious cult. I would see how the pastor would treat non-members and members that didn't comply with what he wanted, and I would think, I hope he doesn't start acting this way towards me. He would berate people, gossip, expect us to stay at his house until late hours, and forbid us from hanging out with non-members. He even asked me to move in there when I had already found my own place. I noticed it was a cult when I told them I was hanging out with an old friend, and proceeded to ask me why I was doing that, and that they were my friends. I came to the service the following Sunday, and the pastor sees me and says, I had a message I was going to preach, but I'm going to preach it a different way today. The whole service was pretty much him, talking horrible things about me and making rude jokes. I knew this sermon was about me when he kept referring to person hanging out with other people and saying it was sinful and of the world. I'd never felt more embarrassed in my life with everyone laughing at me. I just sat there taking it the whole service. Once I left, several of the members attempted to contact me, a few of them trying to go to the movies with me at midnight when they knew damn well the closest movie theater was an hour away, and what movie theater would show movies at midnight? After I stopped going to that church, a few members completely stopped talking to me, despite us being friends. I still can't believe that happened. My dad claimed to be in a satanic cult back in the day. From what he told me, this cult seemed to be the real deal. Necrophilia, worship of Satan, and every member had to get a pentagram tattoo. My dad had one, but after he left, he got a tattoo over it. But you can still see a faint outline of the original. This cult supposedly killed people. They are most likely located in Arizona near Tucson. That's where he found them. He said he joined because his wife and kid were murdered. He was not in the best of mental health, and he said he didn't do anything bad. but he did supposedly kill one of the cult members that was responsible for his old family's death. He said that when he was there, they ended up getting his dead grandma on the phone. He said that it sounded just like her, and she said, "I'll see you in hell, Eric," and started laughing maniacally. Then, after all of that, when he left, something might have followed him and attached itself to me. After my dad left a year ago, things started to get weird. I think whatever this thing was realized my dad was getting old and weak, and thought I would be a better victim to terrorize. The only other explanation I have was the one time I astral projected when I was 7, and I could see something following me Insidious style. I don't know if I should believe him, but it sounds real. Plus, he has the tattoo. The cults are one of those typical mid-80s to 90s cults, so for the most part, I think they're long gone. I was part of a cult church when I was invited soon after I started attending school at UF. Since I was looking for a church to attend, this worked out great. I was invited by a really nice guy and started attending every service, getting to know everyone and making great friends. The services seemed to be a bit extreme, a little too fire and brimstone, but I decided to ignore that and focus on what I agreed with them. I started to get a little bit uncomfortable when they tried to get me to recruit people on the street, but I really felt very uneasy when they said I shouldn't hang out with my friends that followed other religions and even other family members because they weren't good influences. Despite all this, I kept going because of the people there. It wasn't until my sociology class did a unit on cults and how they work, being nice and friendly and then trying to separate people from their friends and family so they won't be persuaded to leave. After that, I decided to stop attending services, although I stayed in touch with some people. It's a real shame because most of them are born-again Christians and don't know that a real church isn't like that. They're great people, just led by the wrong person. I am a 17-year-old boy from New England, and this was an incident that took place about 3 years ago. This was the most traumatic experience I've ever had as a kid. For background, I live in a fairly quiet suburb and always hated school and had friends who hated it as well. My best friend Kevin had decided one day to bunk school. We were very mischievous kids after all. We weren't very big, so we could sneak past people and through things quite easily. Our school's fence wasn't the most secure, so getting out wasn't too challenging, as our school never had cameras at the time either. The exit from this fence led to a long, quite remote road with abandoned houses. This road was really vacant and quiet. Nobody lived there besides a few old folks, so the chances of us being spotted from leaving school were slim. A lot of kids used to hang out there, as there was a woody area nearby and a bush with not many people around. We decided to go to Kevin's house, as his house was closer than mine, as well as being en route. On our way to his house, we saw a man standing about a quarter of a mile away. He was medium build and wore a mask of a horse to be specific. The mask looked like an actual horse's head. This guy gave us chills down our spines. We then greeted him awkwardly with a, "Hey, nice mask, dude." We got no response from the guy and Kevin said, "It isn't Halloween today, bro." We still didn't get a reply, so we decided to turn around, and when we did, we saw another person wearing a rabbit mask about 10 yards away, and soon more of them came out with animalistic masks on. One had a cleaver, the other had an axe. One guy looked to have a cat in his hand. He pierced his knife into it, and the cat's life faded. My heart dropped to my stomach, and I could see the shock and disgust on Kevin's face as well. At this point, we realized that we were being surrounded and needed to get away quickly. They all stood absolutely still. We noticed that their weapons had fresh blood on them, and Kevin said in a shaky voice, "That's blood, dude." Then I nodded and tilted my head towards a nearby bush, and we proceeded to run. The men began walking forwards towards us. We went into fight or flight and ran. We began screaming and ran past them like we'd never done before, even though the weight of our backpacks was holding us back. We managed to cut through the bush and would lead us to a more populated road. They never chased us, and our lungs were drained and our faces illuminated with utter fear. We found another way to Kevin's house. It was a much longer route, which we didn't really mind due to what happened moments ago. I don't know who those people were or what they wanted. They seemed to be part of some cult who preyed on innocent kids. Perhaps they were just a bunch of weird lunatics trying to play a messed up prank. But then, there was always news about kids who went missing around the area, and I strongly believe that it was those people that had been responsible for the disappearances. It would be pointless to even notify the cops, because the cops in this town were useless. From that day, we decided to never bunk school again. We never shared this with anyone, for fear of getting in trouble for bunking school. To this day, it still gives me the chills knowing what could have happened if we had decided to not get away quick enough. About 2 weeks ago, my two friends and I were bored, and we had just been walking around the area where I lived. As we strolled to the shops, we saw a huge chain-link fence with a lock the size of my fist cutting off an alleyway. I called that it was a house up for sale that was being renovated when the owner went bankrupt. Evidently, they never returned. Being the stupid teens that we were, we thought it would be cool to go and check it out. And at this point I should mention that the area was a lot less built up in terms of housing and shops, as we were in a countryside kind of place. So, we scaled the 6-foot fence and hit the track leading up to the house at a fast pace. We get our first look at the house, and it's obvious that it's been unattended for quite some time. The windows were all plastered with newspapers from 6 years ago, and both the garage and large shed had collapsed through the roof. Yeah, it was quite nasty. We go around the right side of it first and peer through the dirty window panes. All we could make out was a construction worker's jacket, which I must say appeared fairly new, but that was impossible because work here stopped weeks ago. Next to the collapsed garage was a large ditch filled with age-old manure. We go back around and investigate the left side. I instantly flipped out and started backing off when on at least 6 walls throughout the side archway were covered with pentagrams and 666s. One of my friends was unsure what all that meant, so I had to educate him on it all. We all became kind of on edge. We slowly tread through the archway, and on our side was a whitewashed wooden door with a shiny silver doorknob. This time someone had gone all out. On the door was a pentagram with ram horns as well as blood in a handprint placed in the middle. Underneath it was simply written, "Hell." We debated whether or not to go inside, and one of my friends plucks up the courage to do so. Inside the dark room was a broken, dirty toilet. I'll let you imagine what the smell was like, and an old fridge down on its side. We opened the fridge just to humor ourselves. We wished we hadn't. Inside was a Tupperware box with legit, bloody, severed human fingers. Needless to say, we ran with the wind carrying us home. Anonymous fingerless man, let's not meet. This happened last night. My friends and I were all hanging out, and it had already been a hectic afternoon, without getting into too much detail. It was a relatively warm evening, so we were going for a walk around the town that the majority of us lived in, which is something we do often enough that we would have felt safe doing it individually, let alone the group of 7 people we were in now. There were 2 15-year-olds and 4 16-year-olds, one of which was a month away from being 17, so we had been walking for over an hour now. We always walked to this ice cream shop, which is the furthest point from the house we meet at before we turn around and go back. We were already halfway home, from there at this 4-way intersection by a Dunkin' Donuts. We're approaching the intersection, laughing about something stupid, when this lady across the street starts screaming. She was borderline old, late 40s to mid 50s. The crazy lady goes, "Wait, stop!" She runs across the intersection through the traffic to get to us. Now at this point, all instincts are telling us to turn around. The problem was, to get home, we had to go in the direction this person was running from. We approach the intersection just as she reaches us. "Oh good, you're all teenagers. Will you come to our concert later?" Crazy lady says. "We have 4 bands. It's teenager music. We've got free pizza and snacks like brownies and cookies. We even got a popcorn machine." Needless to say, we were a little disconcerted. We tried to politely decline, saying that it was getting dark and that we were on our way home. However, she would not let us get a word in edgeways. My friend tried to tell this lady that she didn't like that type of music, but she quickly changed her original statement. "It's all kinds of music. Come on, you'll love it. If you don't like it, you can walk right back out. It's just a mile up the street right over there. Come on, you'll fit right in." She then tries to force us in the direction of the concert, trying to get us to follow her. As if there hadn't already been multiple red flags, this was the first of the most significant ones. All of us were extremely uncomfortable now, but trying to laugh it off, my cousin was smart. She held up her phone to her ear as if she was calling someone. There was terrible self-service in my town, and I know she was faking it, which is something that made everyone even more nervous. "Hello? Oh yeah, we're on our way back now. We'll be there in a few minutes." "Sorry, my dad's calling," she says to the crazy lady. Now, crazy lady took practically no notice of this. She just kept trying to convince us. By now, the sun was almost completely set. We were all itching to just get out of there and go home. "We have to ask our parents first." And here's the most unsettling part of the whole conversation. "No, don't tell your parents. It's only a half-mile up that road. You all have cell phones, don't you? You can just call them on the way there." Now, we were all more than a little nervous. Everyone is looking at Dunkin' Donuts as though if we looked hard enough, we'd teleport. Nobody really says anything at this point. We don't know what to say. "Don't worry. It's in a church. Nothing bad is going to happen to you." Cue nervous laughter and muffled disagreements. "It's on until 9. We'll be there in half an hour." She gestures across the street to this other lady and 2 kids in matching yellow t-shirts. They come running across immediately, and as we get a closer look, it's obvious these kids are extremely uncomfortable and would rather be anywhere else in the world. The other lady is definitely older, as she has white hair. "These guys are coming to our concert. They don't know anyone. But," the other lady interjects as the kids hand out a few flyers, "they don't know anyone? Perfect." At this point, we're all done with this conversation. We have no intentions of being kidnapped 10 minutes from our destination, and we start walking across the crosswalk to Dunkin' Donuts. They want assurance that we'll go later, and we give it to them, falsely of course. We went into Dunk's because there were more people in there, and we felt safer since there hadn't been anyone on the street. All I can say is to the crazy lady and her friends who were trying to lure a bunch of kids to the cult church concert thing, let's not meet again. There is a cult near my town. Most people seem to have come to the conclusion that they worship animals and hold certain pagan rituals to bring them to a higher existence, generally by burning them alive. Animal carcasses have been found all over the swamp, where they tend to meet, and I've stumbled across a skinned cat once. There is a bridge which seems to be the epicenter of the cult's activities. The bridge itself has many legends about it, and over time has taken the name of Satan's Bridge. Stories of haunted mansions, cemeteries, and suicides are ripe with that bridge, and the kids around it go on spooky adventures there, like me. Almost 2 years ago, my friends and I were chased by several cars flashing their lights and honking their horns. Last year, I went back with a much bigger group and was chased off with even more ferocity than before. At one point, almost being run off the road. A few months after we were chased away, we returned with guns. The only thing that happened was we saw a hooded figure peeking over the railing near the bridge. We didn't dare go looking for them. Soon after, we went again, and this time we heard distinct whistling, and at one point a scream that seemed to be from a girl. Also, one of our most recent times, we all got a very sick feeling as soon as we turned onto the road, and we felt as if we were being watched. Another time we tried out this little urban legend to see what would happen. The story goes that if you park your car near the bridge at night and turn it off, lights and all, then you see a pale girl run from the woods begging for help. We parked and waited for 10 minutes when we saw something in the woods moving. We actually got very excited thinking the legend was true, but we were wrong. The sounds of barking dogs echoed from the shadowy figure as soon as we rolled our windows down. It became pretty clear that we were being watched by whatever group worships there. We waited to see what the man would do, but he just stared at us through the dark woods. The reason I'm sharing this is because I find the situation to be incredibly intriguing. I was wondered if anyone might have stories similar, or even a suggestion on what my friends should try next. We've been pretty dedicated to figuring this group out for a while. I started realizing I was in a cult when things made less sense as I grew older. I started to find serious plot holes in the holy doctrine of the cult. No one would answer my questions, and I was punished a lot for being a rebellious kid, just because I wouldn't participate in activities without questioning them. Everyone outside the cult was evil and a slave to the system, including former cult members. When my older sister left, I remember crying hysterically because I'd been told that backsliders go to hell. When I had school friends over that weren't in the cult, back before the cult forced all cult children to be pulled out of public school and into homeschooling, school friends were weirded out. When I went to school friends' houses and noticed they had everything I was told was evil, like books and movies and stickers, as we could only listen or watch media produced by the cult. Some old PG movies were okay after careful screening. When I got a hold of some material written by a former cult member, laying out its horrible history and talking about life outside, was when I realized that all this intimate stuff wasn't normal. There was also the fact that when the son of the leader tried to end his mum for abusing him throughout his childhood, and in a dark way. He also ended the life of his childhood babysitter, and then his own. I sat in commune meetings reading a statement denying the accusations, condemning the son as insane and going to hell, and mourning the death of the babysitter. Like you guys, the stuff his accusations were based on were all documented. Literally, it's all on paper, pictures and recordings. I think that day was the day the last bit of my faith died. Thankfully, my family left the cult shortly after. My elementary school closed down after I left, and after a few years, it was converted into a church. This isn't an average church because it's massive, almost like a complex at this point. It has dozens of rooms and seems almost exclusive for a church, but whatever. I'm not a religious person, so I've never actually attended church before, so if anyone would like to tell me if it's normal, I'd appreciate it. The first thing that I noticed that was off was they demolished the old playground behind the building and filled it in with white gravel. It's just a field of white gravel now. This may be for parking purposes, but I've never seen it used, as there aren't usually enough people there to require it. Next, I was driving home from dinner and noticed an old scorched car. It was also cut in half, protruding out of the front yard of the building. It looked like it had been burnt or in an accident, and painted. On the front were the words, "The end is near." I was immediately taken aback by this, as it came out of nowhere and kind of seemed like fear-mongering. A person I know who attended the church there one day noticed some odd things. The chapel, which used to be the gym, was painted jet black on all four walls, and they had two big flat-screen TVs flashing "God is good" rapidly. He also mentioned something that I had noticed earlier as well. All the girls who attended church seemed to be younger, between the ages of 16 to 20, while all men appeared to be much older. I've also noticed this while driving past the place. I've witnessed men in dark suits walking around the property at night, as if they were guards, though they're not always there. They will also block traffic without wearing any reflective gear, in order to let their churchgoers exit. They usually just block the road completely, and don't allow anyone to pass. All these things separately wouldn't be weird if isolated, but together, they have raised my curiosity and those people around me. I'm having a conversation with a guy who actually attended it, and asked him to describe some of the things. Keep in mind, I don't know how true any of his part is. He said that there are a lot of valets who will park your car for you, and they all just look dead inside. Just another interesting thing to throw in. He also thinks there's a link to Chick-fil-A, because many of the girls who work there go to this church. Perhaps this is a coincidence, but I'm just putting it out there. My mum's aunt's husband, William, was born in a place in our country that is well known for practicing black magic, and he managed to live with my mum's aunt Maria, as well as his two sisters. By living, I mean he was their romantic partner. Nobody could believe that my Aunt Maria was doing that. Every time someone asked why she was with him, she responded, "I don't know." Years passed, and one of William's sisters gave birth to a baby girl. When the girl reached puberty, he took her as a partner also. Maria started having discussions with him, and William decided to move to another house with his two sisters and niece/daughter, although he was still Maria's partner. Time passed, and one of my grandma's friends came to visit. When she heard about Maria's situation, she went to her house, and she told that William was using secrets to keep her head down and accept whatever he'd do. The old lady told Maria there's got to be a work in the property she was living, and they started looking for it. A few hours later, my mum says they found a small glass container buried next to the main door. Inside, a black substance and other items. Maria asked the old lady if she should throw that thing into a river, as it's a common belief, but the old lady said doing it would be a mistake. If she threw it into a river, she could never be free from that work. Instead, they should burn it. My mum's aunt did it, and left the man the next day, and stopped being ill all the time. Now, on to the next story. Turns out that while Maria was still living with William, people living in the same town started reporting sightings of a big pig that appeared at night and would attack them. Maria said when William heard about the pig, he laughed and said he wished the pig would appear to him. A few nights later, he was going home from a bar late at night, and he said the pig came out from a secondary street and ran at him. William said he took out a knife that he carried everywhere and cut the pig in the stomach. The pig ran away bleeding and screaming. Maria says that William left the next day to visit one of his best friends and came back a bit shaken. Apparently, when William asked to speak to Charles, Charles' son told him he was very ill and didn't want to talk to anyone. William, being his best friend, told the kid to step aside and that they grew up together and that he wanted to see him. William says he was very angry and shocked to see Charles about to pass with a cut on his stomach. William told him he didn't know he was putting into practice knowledge from their natal city, and told him he was sorry. Charles apparently could only whisper he couldn't have known, and William stayed with him until he passed. My grandma, my father's mum, told me a story 1,000,000 times of how she travelled to the other side of the country to bring my uncle back home, who was serving in the army during a civil war. She says an old lady told her a prayer that would make him invisible for them, the army people and people in the conflict, and my grandma paid a fortune for the old lady, and apparently it worked. This was a long time ago, and it took them weeks to travel from the city my uncle was at, the same city where William was born in fact, to my grandma's house. Now, my grandma always repeated the prayers at night, and told me and my sister to say it when we felt in danger. I thought it was old people stuff, but I did what I was told. My mum knew this, and a year or so ago, she came to my house and started on me, telling me how she was watching a documentary about the Holy Death Cult, or La Santa Muerte. She says she was actually falling asleep when one of the cult's practitioners started talking about some prayers and started saying the exact prayer my grandma says. Of course, it freaked her out, and I can't tell my grandma she is very religious and very old. She'd have a heart attack, I'm sure. This same grandma used to tell me how witches have rituals and prayers to change their human form to animal form, how they had to boil water and let their skin that had fallen during the ritual in there, and how it is a must to come back before dawn, or you would be trapped in the animal form forever, and that there were other tips and norms she mentioned about this, and how also you could protect yourself from them. But I don't feel very comfortable discussing all these rituals. I'm British and live in England, and this story takes place when I was 15. It's bugged me out since it's happened. I was playing video games on a Wednesday night, and there was a knock on the door at about 11 PM, which was out of the ordinary and in itself a little odd. My mum was the one who answered it, but since it was so late, I came down to see for myself. We have a square-shaped spiral staircase with platforms as you go down each step, and there's a balcony at the top which I could overlook. It was also dark, so it would be hard for me to see, especially from outside the front door. When my mum opened the door, there were two men who she described as sounding German, wearing black suits. They were pasty white, tall, clean-shaven, and quite bulky. They didn't say anything like why they were there, what they wanted, or who they were. They were just asking if I were home. Just asking if I were home. What got me though, was they didn't just go by my first name, but also my last name, Troughton, like the second Doctor, which isn't common. My mum thankfully said no, and told them they had the wrong house. My mum, after she closed the door, told me that they were still outside looking at our windows. She told me to stay out of sight, since she thought they were trying to eye the house up to see if I were home or not. After about 20 minutes, they finally left the pavement, but my mum was convinced they'd sit in their cars still watching, so I hid for a bit longer. It was really intimidating, especially considering I was 15 and had never done anything malicious. This was 3 years ago, and I've heard nothing since. I've always wondered who they were, what they wanted, or if it was even a malicious encounter. Nevertheless, it truly freaked me out. I do have some theories though. It was a harmless prank by a friend, calling some religious group to my house. I somehow ended up on a cult's list, or my deep web searches could have led them to me somehow. My wife went to Lower Valley Pike. The school was extremely strict and a total dry campus. Cigarettes and alcohol would get you expelled on your first offense. The RDs and RAs were sent out to the typical places people would often try and hide in order to bust people. For this reason, she and her friends would go a good distance away to do their partying. The area was pretty remote, and there's a good deal of scenic/wooded area, so a 10 to 20 minute drive felt further away than it was, because the distance was worth it. Because, nobody wants to be expelled over a pack of Virginia Slim 100s. She says that Clifton, Ohio and the surrounding area were always just eerie at night, and said that in the late fall, things got very unsettling. Once, on one of these trips into BFE for some Boone's farm, she walked away from her group of friends to pee, and found a large garbage can full of domestic-type animals, dogs, cats, that had no signs of injury other than they had had their throats cut and blood drained out completely. My wife has hunted, and is familiar with the idea that big game needs to have the blood drained so it doesn't spoil the meat, but said nobody was going to eat these animals, and she also informed me that the practice is unnecessary. Needless to say, this is enough to freak out a typical group of college girls. Another time she came across a large plastic rubber-style baby doll that again had had its throat slit. It was naked and had holes cut in inappropriate areas and stuffed with things that she can't really recall, but nothing belonging to a baby doll. She said that a number of times in her 4 years in the area, they came across a decent-sized fire set in the middle of a road randomly. She said there'd be no reason for them to be there either, no houses nearby, just wood fire on asphalt. One year she volunteered to help clean for people in the area as part of a larger service project. She and a friend went to one house, and she says she experienced a complete feeling of utter dread the whole time she was there with no explanation. Just a pit of your stomach feeling that something very bad is going to happen, and every part of your body is screaming at you to get away. She didn't see anything or have any odd occurrences while being there, just that the whole place felt bad and the woman of the house was weird. When I asked her to elaborate, she said she couldn't. My wife says she also assumes it was some kind of satanic stuff the whole time, and a few of her friends actively went out looking for the creepy things after they came across them the first few times, but could never find them again, and she said that they made her feel sick. I didn't know my wife when she was in college, so I've asked her to take me and show me around and tell me stories, take me to the local places, and she did, once. She showed me her dorm and stuff, and on the way out there in the middle of nowhere there was a random house with things hanging in a tree that weren't decorations. Kids' toys perhaps? I told her to pull over and asked if she saw it, and she just kept going on and said, "Don't look, just ignore it. We don't want to know." We only live an hour away, but she really doesn't like going back and spending any more time on or around campus. She doesn't like to talk about this stuff, and based on that reaction, I can tell that she was really shaken by it all. This story is about me, and a guy who I've known for about 2 years, Perseus. I met him through a mutual friend, though we're no longer friends with that first friend, but became friends with Perseus and his roommates. At the time I didn't have much of a social life, as I worked weird hours and drifted apart from people, and these guys were really welcoming. I'd had no luck with dating lately, and they were really enthusiastic about helping me with that. The guy called his group of friends a tribe, and hosted parties at their house. And then one night, he invited me out with him meeting some friends at a library to attend a class, and Perseus told me on Facebook that he wanted me to come. So I went, and it was Perseus sitting at a table with some friends and reading some self-help book. I personally am not into the self-help scene, but I know this is a very diverse scene, but generally it was never my thing. I like seeking advice and stuff, and I'm all about improving myself in different ways. But reading hundreds of pages? Nah. I'd rather read something else, like politics or fiction. So I politely listened to him and tried to get into it for a bit. I was considering reading the book, but really just wasn't interested. After we went out for beers and had a good time. So I ended up going to the classes sometimes, but it was mostly to have a social life. I did kind of enjoy the academic environment a bit, but overall wasn't really impressed with this self-help book. To me, it mostly sounded like generic advice I could get everywhere, so not my thing. So I go to some of their parties and have a great time. One of them is good at giving me some constructive criticism, which I honestly appreciated, and I was bonding well with Perseus and some of the other group members. At one point, when we were in a car, one of the guys told me I really should come to the classes, because they level up at each one, and I told him that I was busy at work. Months go by, more parties, generally having a good time, and I generally like the group, but a few things rubbed me the wrong way. It's hard to explain, but it turns out one of them actually did have severe mental illness, but he left the house at some point. It was more the obsession that Perseus in particular had with self-help stuff. He had loads of books on it. The whole teaching a class kind of thing weirded me out, and Perseus, who did have a university degree, instead of becoming an academic at a usual university, would tell me plans of opening an online one and teaching critical thinking, logic, and self-improvement. One day, I was visiting his house. The house was chill to hang out in, because it was casual. I was sitting in the living room and heard him talking to someone on the phone, saying something along the lines of, "Oh, so-and-so is calling me a cult leader. Sure, I'm a cult leader, but I'm an ethical cult leader. I would never get someone to drink poison." Red flags? Or was I overreacting? Time goes on. I just brush off me hearing him say that. I just figure he might have been joking, or doesn't quite understand what a cult means. Anyway, more parties happen, generally cool. I help them move, and he does things, Perseus, that rub me the wrong way sometimes. Like one time we were at a coffee shop, and a good-looking woman passes, and he says to us other guys, "Wow, look at her tits." And I'm like, okay. And the thing is, I'm not prude or anything. I talk to my friends about sex sometimes. I just think it's kind of trash talk. I don't say anything because I have the feelings of these guys, who are kind of like bro and dude-like, and will just tell me I'm overly PC or sensitive. If I see a nice-looking woman pass by, I might say, "Wow, she's pretty," to my buddy or something like that. But really, that's just vulgar, and vulgarity is one of my personal pet peeves. But I'm not going to ask him to change just for me. During this whole time, almost every time, he is pushing me to read The Mystery Method and the other pickup artist material. We're getting to the drama now. I talk to him and he gives me advice. Some of his advice generally isn't bad advice. I go through life, and with all the people I befriend, I take whatever advice I can get to help in general. In the summer, I read about 20% of The Mystery Method, and I think it's mostly stupid. Pretty much telling me to go into bars and bug every woman. Like, no, I don't want to do that. That's just creepy. So I stop reading. Later on, he continues to poke me to start reading these books again. One time at a coffee shop, he pretty much loudly says, "Dude, don't you want a dick in your mouth?" This rubs me the wrong way. But whatever, okay. Are you still with me? So here's the drama. Oh, did I mention Perseus almost every time I see him is going on in front of the other tribe about his latest experience, where he got a woman's attention in front of her boyfriend, the alpha, or one time when he danced with a woman but didn't sleep with her because he timed the order in which he did things wrong. This really weirded me out. We started having hangouts where we'd chill, play some games, maybe cards, and have a few beers, and smoke and the like. So I go to one, and it's just a few of us. Half the people there of the tribe are in the kitchen cooking, and it's just me, Perseus, and another guy who is new. A young, impressionable guy who likes Jordan Peterson. So at one point I tell Perseus what's going on in my dating life. Although at the time I wasn't dating anyone, I had two prospects, although one was long distance, and we were meaning to meet up. But she flakes. And another woman who I had just started talking to. But we hadn't met yet, and only started, but things were looking generally good. So I told him about this great new woman I was talking to. Perseus starts going on about how I never sealed the deal. There's truth to that, sure. So I was hoping I could tell him more about this woman. Instead, he reaches into his bookshelf and puts a PUA book in front of me, the one I started reading and quit. He tells me for the dozenth time that this is the key, and here's where it starts. I don't recall exactly everything that led to it to getting more heated, but I remember telling him I wasn't into the whole PUA self-help scene. He then reminded me that I was having no luck lately with women. I told him it was true, but told him things were generally getting better, and that I was working on it. He then reminded me that I'm not having luck, and that this will help me. I bring up something along the lines of a lot of the self-help stuff being based around evolutionary psychology, which, while the legit field, is something I personally didn't trust. I feel that, and many critics do, much of the evolutionary psychology is based on speculation, or there are books written that I've found that support an agenda and use evolutionary psychology, but will cherry-pick facts to suit it. He gets defensive about that not being true, and both our voices are raised a bit at this point, but I see he is being aggressive with me now, and he asks me, "Do you believe in evolution? Do you believe in psychology? Then how can you say that evolutionary psychology isn't a legit field?" He then brings up that many people in some fields don't like people in other fields, which is true, sure. So this goes back and forth. I tell him he's pushing his beliefs onto me, and he asks me what pushing means, asking me to define it. I tell him I'm not into the self-help scene. What's wrong with helping oneself? Everyone wants to help themselves. He also tells me I'm pushing my views onto him, and the others by not listening to what he has to say. He tells me I'm being irritating because I was asking for dating advice, and now I'm refusing to listen when he's giving to it. I wanted friendly advice, sure, but not a book. So basically, I need to read this book or I'll never kiss a woman again. He doesn't say it, but sure as hell implies it. Like, he never once asked me about this woman I was speaking to, her background or interests or what we talk about. To give me advice, he just gives me a book. I tell him I'm not interested, and he insists it's a diverse scene and that you can't judge it. But since he's pushing me, I tell him what I really think. Honestly, I don't respect the whole self-help industry. I think most of them are scammers. This triggers him. I'm taking that personally, because you just insulted my profession. I've been writing a self-help book for years. I didn't know this, and I tell him I didn't know this. But the genie's out the bottle. He tells me I haven't read any of the books that I judge. I tried, and they sucked. And he continues. No, you sound aggressive to me, he says. He tells me he read all of my short stories, as I'm a fiction writer, and was all upset that I never once went to his website, when I didn't even know he had one. And I'm not interested, so what? I ask him straight up, so to hang out with you I need to go on your website. Don't remember what he said, and he keeps pressing me on why I didn't read the books. I tell him I won't read them, and he has to accept that, but he keeps pressing me. I tell him straight up, I think many of the books are misogynistic. He asks if I call him a misogynist. He says, do you think my girlfriend thinks I'm a misogynist? Misogyny means hatred of women. Do you understand that? So I'm mentally out the door now. He keeps telling me I'm being unreasonable. I tell him I feel really freaked out right now and feel like he's being aggressive with me, and I'm getting quite angry. The argument continues. He tells me I don't listen. I go to the fridge, grab the beers I bought, and I leave the wrapping in the fridge because I'm in a rush to get out. Perseus demands I not leave garbage in the fridge. I take it out and start heading towards the door and tell him to stop using rhetorical manipulative techniques on me. I tell him what I thought, that his classes were creepy, and he slams the door in my face. I take my beers. By the way, we both had only had one drink at this point, so it's not the alcohol. And I text him while I'm waiting for the cab. Dude, that wasn't cool. I've never seen anyone act like that before. You were poking me, dude. Not all your friends are going to want this self-help stuff. If they tell you they don't want it, leave them alone. He texts me after a few minutes and says, you sound upset. Maybe take some space to reflect. Later on, he texts me again. We had a communication issue. I'm sorry you perceived me as being aggressive. Hopefully, we can get on better next time. No, not cool. We're done. You seriously freaked me out. Don't try to gaslight me. Goodbye. I go home and don't want to sleep. What the? Am I overreacting? Obviously, the way I said this seemed so biased, but I'm telling you everything to the best of my ability. I've been through a lot of manipulation lately by people in my life, and people acting strangely to me and telling me I'm at fault. Was I the asshole? I started Impramerica in spring of 2010. Back then, Sunday was the day no one worked. That changed to, you should earn your Sunday off. Early on it was, if you wanted to miss a big event, well, we can't force you to go. Eventually it became, you better go, no excuse. Having outside interests was frowned upon, to the point that there was no discussion about them. Primerica was sold to me, and I sold it to other people as freedom. But when I left in summer of 2012, there didn't seem to be any freedom remaining. It felt like there could be no discussion inside the office that wasn't Primerica related, even if you're in the bathroom eating lunch. I mean, some of us were having to gather outside of the office, often a building or two away, to talk about something that had nothing to do with Primerica. or even voice our concerns about the company. Yes, at their place where you work, you may be concerned about complaining about the company inside the building. However, you aren't concerned about talking about non-work stuff while at lunch in the break room. I had an upline who didn't want us to talk about non-work stuff in the office at all. That is not freedom. There was a speaker from out of state who came to speak with us. There was an upcoming convention, and they spoke of a convention where they maxed out their credit cards to personally rent a bus for their recruits. But they had no recruits, so that was motivation to start really recruiting and have them pay their share for a seat on said bus. So, this rippled into our office, where we were expected to personally invest some more into trips, buses, tickets, hotels, and have our downlines pay us back. When your downline is a part-time waitress who has to save up to take her insurance test, you honestly can't drop her the news that she's also on the hook for paying you back for her seat and hotel share that you already paid for, and yes, she still has to pay for her tickets. Hey, great news, Rosie. In addition to that licensing test and the money you have to pay out for your fingerprints in order for your insurance license, you also need to pay me $50 for your bus seat and your share of the hotel that we as a group will be sharing, about $20, and your food is also on you. In addition, it's $75 for your ticket to this convention, and no, you can't just attend the major events. You're expected to attend a few of the workshops, which are also $25 each. And that also added to the cult-like problems I felt. I was licensed, I was making sales, and the company was nickel and diming me every time I turned around. Major events I had to buy no less than 5 tickets. Not the convention, but every 3-month events, and having my recruits buy them from me, as well as sell them when recruiting to new people. To start making this money, you need to give me at least a list of 100 people and their phone numbers, as well as $100. We have a big event next month, and attendance is compliant, and that's $20. Please, if you have $100, then you have $120. You don't have to pay me for the ticket now, you just make some minor cuts over the week, and you'll have the $20 for this life-changing event ticket. Yeah, I felt dirty saying stuff like that. There was also that I had to pay subscriptions for the online tool used to sell policies to families and additional material like pamphlets and such, and I also had to pay for them myself. I have worked in sales before, but I was never expected to pay for sales tools. Having to constantly police what I talk about and seeing my commission checks drained by the very company I'm selling for. Think about that episode of The Boondocks where the little girl wants to buy a pony. So she sells lemonade to some rich guy, makes her a deal where he would help her get her pony via the lemonade stand. But eventually it's clear that he screwed her over and she would have to pay for all the supplies and send her money to him, where she was actually losing money while he made all the money, even though he did no work and no financial involvement, just collecting the money. That's almost how Primerica felt when I left. This event took place a few years ago, but I remember it as if it were all happening right now. I live in southeast Pennsylvania in the US, and local law tells of a road thought to be more or less haunted, or better said, inhabited. Stories tell of a satanic cult that raises spirits and the like at a church hidden in the woods near the road, and of a crazed family, some say the DuPont family, or of another unnamed family, that has lived there for generations. Locals call the area Satanville, though as you can imagine this is not the area's true town name. No matter who lives there, there's one unifying element that exists in all accounts. If you go there, a vehicle will appear and chase you out or run you off the road. If you do this and then disappear, sort of a pick your poison thing, Whichever you choose to believe in, something is out there. Their stories also mention that if you slow down and roll your windows down, you can hear whispers and footsteps just off the road, just behind the tree, and that the trees themselves are afraid of the road and will grow leaning away from it. There is also one particular tree that grows out on the side of a small hill, and the roots take the shape of a skull. I told you all of this in order to set the scene, to save you the time of having to look it all up yourself. The following account is of my trip to this place. It was a warm October night, and me and my girlfriend and our 3 friends all decide we'd heard enough about this Satanville and wanted to see for ourselves what it was all about. So we piled into our friend's Suzuki 4-door and left. The road is hard enough to find on its own because on both ends the sign reading Cossart Road have been removed, as that was the road's true name, due to, presumably, people like us going there where people like us were not wanted. We took the hard right onto the road between the 2 stone pillars and overgrowth and proceeded slowly down the road, taking in all the creepy sights. Immediately we noticed our cell phones dropped service. No bars, no Gs, no nothing. That was unsettling, but hey, sometimes that happens. But all our phones did this, and we had with us all 3 major carriers. We found that trees do indeed lean away from the road, and that there are road signs with "Go away" and "Keep out" sprayed on them. One said 666, but I chalked that up to plain old silly vandalism. We slowed to a near stop and rolled down the window to hear the whispering and the footsteps. Of course, this story wouldn't be interesting if we didn't hear them, and we did. Not so much whispering as the wind itself coming through the trees, whipping the dead leaves on the ground to make it sound like hushed consonants being muttered. However, we did hear what sounded like footsteps. Perhaps maybe it was deer rustling away from the road. This is Pennsylvania after all, and deer are everywhere, so why not a back road in the woods? We made it to the other end of the road in no particular hurry. We went very slow. We decided to take our chances and head back through the other way. We turned around, got ourselves situated, and prepared to turn back in. That's when it appeared. A 2-door Chevy Cavalier. The reason I told you how slow we went was to illustrate that no other cars were on the road with us, and we would have seen lights or heard another car coming. Yet this car appeared from the road behind us seemingly mere seconds after we did. Not a terribly imposing vehicle, except for the million candle power brights it had, and the otherworldly roar of its engine. I know what a terrible muffler sounds like, and this was not it. This car had had work done to make it quick and powerful. It stopped facing the road perpendicular to us, so our light beams were crossed. It revved its engine twice and peeled away down the road behind us. We were spooked, but otherwise not affected by it, and laughed it off. That is until it began turning around. It snapped around in a hurry and was about 50 yards back when it began blaring its horn and revving again. My friend Laurie, who was driving, screamed, "Oh my God, turn around." We all panicked and began yelling and screaming. Laurie demanded I drive, as she felt I would do better driving than her. I'm a dude, but frankly, I was equally as scared as she was, and hopped out of the car and took my place. The car must have seen us do this, because with a scream of its tires it was after us. I took to the left, back onto the road, and in no time this car was on our back, with inches to spare. Who or what was driving this car had done this before. It made no sign of slowing around some of the sharper turns and slopes. Whoever this was knew the road well. They were behind us and laying on the horn, and no speed I dare reach on this unfamiliar road would shake them. We reached a wider point in the road, and the car passed us. Like a ghost, it seemed to almost pass through the hill next to us, because while the road was wider, it wasn't two cars next to each other wide. It began to pull away, and I remembered the part of the story of these cars where they disappear into the woods. I did my best to keep up with it, but he pulled further away until I could only catch his taillights around every corner. We reached the end of the road, and there it was, parked next to the exit facing away from us. Lights off, silent. I bravely and stupidly decided to attempt to see inside the vehicle, but the windows were tinted too dark to see in. At this moment, the car sprang to life, as if it were some creature disturbed, and revved its engine and honked. I floored it out of there and onto the main road. I don't know who it was that chased us back out there, but I do know something did not want us there. Some unnamed person lurking in the woods, waiting for people like us to drive by, getting a little too big for their britches. Regardless of what chased me, I know for certain I won't be returning anytime soon to Satanville, Pennsylvania. I was hunting with a friend of mine, Tom, deep in the mountains of North Carolina. We went to the top of a ridge to get a good look at the area and try to pick a likely place to find some pigs. I saw a dirt road to the east, a fire trail actually, and was about to write it off when I noticed a row of campers driving along it. They disappeared behind a hill at the edge of the valley. I scanned the valley floor and found several other campers near the tree line. Tom suggested we go over to see if they would share a meal and a warm fire with two worn-out hunters. It was dark by the time we got over the hill, and they disappeared behind, so we climbed up to get a good last bearing and a distance estimate, and what we found was surreal. About a half a mile away, in the middle of the clearing, was a bonfire. Instinctively, we both dropped to the ground and crawled for some brush for cover overlooking the valley. I scanned the area looking for the camp and any security they might deploy. Tom surveyed the other side of the valley. When he grabbed my arm, I turned and followed his gaze. There were two groups of people standing near the edge of the valley right below us. One was wearing black hoods and robes, the other white. A figure carrying a staff was wearing a red hooded robe, walked out of the trees towards the fire, and the others followed in two single file lines. At the fire, the red figure stopped and raised his arm. The black robes circled clockwise, and the white robes counterclockwise, until they completely encircled the fire, alternating black and white. We could hear chanting, but we couldn't make out words. After about an hour of chanting and walking about the fire, first in one direction, then in the other, they stopped, and a naked man was brought out from the tree line, bound and blindfolded. He was presented to each of the robed figures clockwise around the fire, before being presented to the figure in red. He was then made to lie down at the red figure's feet. Then, a naked bound woman was brought out, and the process was repeated counterclockwise before she was laid next to the naked man. I, at least, had no idea what I was watching or what I should do. There was more chanting, and then silence, as four black-robed figures emerged from the tree line, carrying a black robe much like a flag. They circled the flag clockwise, once behind the figures and once in front of them. Each black figure touched the robe as it passed. When they arrived at the red figure, they stopped over the naked man. The red figure said something, and the other responded. He then pointed his staff at the naked man, and the four laid the robe on top of him. Another chant, and a white robe was brought out, and the process was repeated, counterclockwise, stopping over the naked woman. The red figure said something, and the other responded. He then pointed his staff at the naked woman, and all four laid a robe over her. The red figure waved his hand and staff over them and raised the staff over his head. The robe bearer then picked up the robes as they had before, and the two rose from the ground. The robe bearers then lifted the robes over their heads, and the two then circled the fire twice, embracing each member. First the robes of their colour, and then the other. When they got back to the red figure, he pointed towards the camp with his staff, and the new members led the procession back to camp. I watched them enter the tree line, then looked back to the fire for the red figure. He hadn't moved. When the last couple was out of the clearing, the bonfire flashed green, then red, and the red robe collapsed on the ground. We humped all the way back to our truck that night. We were too scared to stop. The next morning we stopped at a Denny's for breakfast. We had put out more than 60 miles between us and that clearing and felt safe. While we were eating, two couples came in. One sat behind Tom and the other behind me, so that each of us saw them. They just smiled at us while we ate. When we left, we saw two campers in the parking lot. Tom and I never spoke about that night, and we found a better hunting area far away from that clearing. It's been nearly 40 years since that night, and every once in a while, I come across a couple in a camper, and they just smile at me. I've always had an interest in hauntings and magical practices since I was a child. My parents were rigid Catholics, so it was not due to any positive exposure. It's been in my nature never to accept what folks tell me offhand, and to find out for myself. That it was forbidden only whetted the interest. I pursued this academically as an adult, and received a Master of Arts in Western Esotericism from the University of Exeter back in 2011. However, my goal in studying ecstatic and visionary experiences from the measurable views provided in biology and physics. My story starts when my wife and I had returned from teaching in Japan for 2 years, and prior to the start of my studies. At the time I was working a temp job, where I was paid to do next to nothing. I think I worked a solid 3 days out of every month, without exaggeration. I had a lot of time to waste. The other guy I worked with has been a journalist for the Houston Chronicle, who had fallen on hard times later in life. The man had stories, though he had an odd fascination with Bigfoot. The one in particular that piqued my interest was his account of a local stretch of road the locals called Spook Road. He regaled me with a story he had heard from a friend who was a park ranger. His friend had apparently observed a group of black hooded figures marching in procession through a cornfield to an abandoned barn off the road. One odd characteristic of this haunting is that it's not simply attached to one event, but numerous stories range from suicides, the murders at the Gitche-Montu State Reserve just south of the road, the natives that still perform their ceremonies there, and practitioners of black magic carrying out rituals there. It's a happening place that has been for the span of memories for everyone in the area. Fast forward to when I had begun my studies and was piecing together my dissertation topic. I was considering John Dee's Enochian practices, which I won't go into here. But one interesting detail is that Anton LaVey's Church of Satan made use of Dee's rituals, only filling off the serial numbers and replacing satanic references where Dee made reference to God. I was working at Jimmy John's, where I opened what became the freakiest, fastest Jimmy Johns in the franchise. The first 4 hours of my shift were alone, and gave me time to plan my papers, while I went about the rote procedure of cutting vegetables, breaking bread, and prepping the cold tables. I was telling my co-workers that I was studying LaVey's satanic rituals, and one of my co-workers, who was usually quiet and a bit zoned out, maybe it was too much weed, as Jimmy John's had no drug testing, so it was pretty common, perked up at the mention of this. He asked me what I knew about Satanism, and I shrugged and stated that Satanism was about as dangerous and evil as a fart in a crowded elevator. He seemed put out at this and ended the conversation. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I asked him what it was he wanted to discuss. His stories were disturbing. He stated that there was a group of Satanists that were prevalent in this area. I will be blunt. He claimed that this group kidnapped and murdered folks, and even went about rituals of secretly birthing children in their group for sacrifice. Now, I take ethics rather seriously, and had just had my first son. I felt ill. But what was interesting is that I had a very odd feeling as he was telling me this. I had the very distinct sensation I was being watched. I had told the co-worker about the black hooded figures on Spook Road, and this made his eyes go wide. He stated that this rather disreputable group were connected to the road thanks to its history and its connection to the supernatural. Apparently he went out to Spook Road rather frequently and had a large number of odd experiences. On one trip, he had gone down the road uneventfully, but upon the return of it, the entire road had changed completely, with houses that shouldn't have been there. On another occasion, he had gone out of the road and didn't feel himself. They stopped at a gas station, and when he went to wash his face, when he looked up into the mirror, his face was not his own. While hiking nearby, he also claimed to have run into odd folk, who had odd characteristics where everything they suggested sounded like a good idea, and he felt compelled to agree. I asked him how he'd heard about this group. Having this been purely of his fabrication was a clear possibility. A woman who was, to him, like a surrogate mother, claimed to have been a part of the group, but had gotten out of it after it proved too much for her. However, she stated that she was still stalked by them, and that apparently these folk had the ability to leave their bodies and follow you, which I informed him was typically called astral projection, and could also enter your dreams. This made the sensation of being watched boil over in terror for me. I instantly felt physically cold, and my stomach twisted in knots. What's more, while apparently the abandoned barn they practiced at off the road had burnt down, he believed that they were using the one north of town. The angle of my studies to this point were merely an interest. I held that essentially reality was wholly based on perception, and that there could be nothing to alter it. The notion of these folks having the capacity to alter a person's perceptions, and also the possibility of people willing to murder others so close to home, if any of this were true, kept me up at night, completely unable to close my eyes. My brother is a well-established psychologist who was finishing his PhD at the time, and he is by far the more grounded of the two of us. I decided I needed to talk to him, to get this nonsense that was keeping me up at night out of my head. I shared all the stories I had heard up until this point, only to him have me cut me off and finish my story in greater detail, though he admitted he had heard of no barn, including human sacrifices. He then asked me if I was familiar with a grimoire called the Grimorium Verum. For him to be conversant on something that I'd not heard of in my own studies caught me off guard. I now own a copy of this book, and it's very frankly grisly in its methods, and aims to rather openly centered on summoning Lucifer and his lieutenants. He then stated this book was apparently the key to their practice. I asked him how it's possible he knew about any of this. He stated he was looking into it, because one of his patients at the moment claimed to be a victim of this very same group, and was afflicted with odd forms of dissociative identity disorder, where his alter ego identified itself as a demon. He surmised it had come from a result of his traumatic experience. My brother then went on to say his fellow staff warned him that this group of people were terribly active and would come in at times posing to be victims. He was cautioned to carefully monitor their symptoms for a lapse in the act. This was all too much for either of us, and following this discussion, we did not talk again for months. We both, unbeknownst to the other, simultaneously had been looking at the same phenomena and had each verified each other's findings and fears. He left that counseling group shortly after and focused on helping kids in deeply troubled households. I did what any mature person would do upon realizing his fears could be very real. I went out to their purported place of practice and all associated locales. I'm nothing if not consistent, and do not accept what is told to me. I always look into it directly myself. So I decided to have a look at all of the areas connected to Spook Road. The barn where these people were purported to practice, the road itself, which my co-worker claimed the group had bound a demon to protect them, and the Gitche Manteau State Reserve, just south of the road. Our co-worker warned me that we should not stay there longer than 6 p.m. on recommendation from the woman who claimed to be a former member. Fine with me. I'd rather have a look when the sun's up. As I have said previously, I am willing to directly investigate all of the occult, paranormal, and supernatural. But I am also deathly afraid of it all, but also exhilarated. My father claims I have a very special kind of stupid, and I am compelled to agree. It was late fall, and while it was bearable, over 30 degrees during the day with a jacket, once the sun went down, it was rather cold. We started off by heading off to the barn north of town. I was immediately underwhelmed. It was definitely an old, run-down barn. My co-worker pointed out pieces of twine that were hanging off posts, and took the time to display that they could be used to tie someone up. I quirked an eyebrow, and was rather convinced this kid was caught up in it all, and was seeing what he wanted to see. I still hold that opinion. We then went up to the loft. Squatters stayed here frequently for sure. Socks, underwear, sleeping bags and shirts were all over. I noticed some satanic graffiti, but assumed that folks all came here having heard such stories and had left their mark. I took a step to the left, right next to where a sleeping bag was, and immediately fell through the floor. I managed to catch myself on the support beams and calmly hoisted myself out. I'm a rock climber amongst other things, and nearly falling is no new thing. I only cursed myself that I had managed to injure myself and burden my wife, who was already adjusting to our first little one over something so broadly ridiculous as a ghost hunt. I deserve whatever was coming to me. We all noted the oddity after that, though most of the floor was too rotten to walk on. Why was a sleeping bag right on it? Also, half of the floor we were walking on had been very recently remade. If a squatter had tried to get in with that sleeping bag, they'd have fallen right through. Puzzling to be sure, But I never got to go back and confirm it at all. As the summer following our exploration, the barn was burnt down in an act of arson that was never solved. This seems an apt time to point out that my co-worker averred that there was a conspiracy afoot as well. He claimed political officials and police were part of this group. Again, I was compelled to think this was him seeing what he wanted to see, but what happened next brought that into question. We headed over to Spruik Road proper. The road had a creek that snakes through in 5 places, meaning 5 bridges. One of the old stories is that when you go across the road one way, you cross 5 bridges, but as you head back, you only cross 4. This, to me, plays on the dull wits of those who turn around on the last bridge and forget to count it. Anyway, there's a cemetery on the final bridge where my co-worker claimed a demon was bound. As we parked on the side of the road near the 4th bridge and walked to the 5th, we spotted a sheriff coming down the road. The 3rd fellow we brought along thought it would be funny to hide behind a tree as he passed. The sheriff thought otherwise and stopped his car and got out. He asked us what we were doing. Previous this, the other 2 wouldn't stop yammering on, but now their tongues had stopped working. I told the sheriff we were out for a hike and pointed to the nearby hiking path. "Why did your friend hide behind a tree when he saw me?" I fought the urge to glare at the dumb kid for doing that, but instead said, "He's an idiot," and thought it would be funny to hide from the cops due to stereotypes. That worked. Just don't cause any trouble. Why on earth was a sheriff patrolling a dead stretch of road no one was on? No cars, no people, just us. And we'd only been on it for minutes and had caused no ruckus. We moved onto the cemetery. As we stepped up, suddenly my guts lurched. I felt ill and dizzy. This struck me as odd, because I'd just fallen through the floor without issue, but a dinky cemetery was giving me the shivers. Then the co-worker told me why he claimed this road was bound with a demon. This is where they bury the infants. We walked through to find a felled tree that had been cut up but left there. This is where it gets odd. There was a full can of lighter fluid next to it, and there was very clearly a path down into the bracken. I couldn't make my feet move. I was completely rooted in terror and had no idea why. My co-worker went down and asked me to come down. I couldn't. I looked to our 3rd, but saw, despite his loud claims of atheism and that this was all crap, that he couldn't move either. Why was there a full can of lighter fluid? Fallen trees are terribly cheap to haul away. Why hadn't this been done? We later looked at the history of the cemetery via Google Earth and saw that the tree had been cut down and laid there for years. I'd had enough and said we should leave. The sun was going down at this point. My co-worker said he wanted to show me Gitchi Mantu first, and I agreed, stating we make it quick. It was really cold now, and we could see our breath. My leather jacket was no longer cutting it, and my hands were freezing even with gloves. My co-worker told us about the murders that had taken place here, but the terror in my guts was now gone, and I was unimpressed. At this point, I was using the walk to get my nerves back in order. My co-worker claimed he had seen a black shadow following us, but I rolled my eyes. I had the feeling he was trying to jazz himself up, because he enjoyed this sort of thing way too much. He then showed us a pond that was actually eerily still, which, while neat, had nothing to do with anything. It was when I noticed voices and saw flashlights shining through the pond. I then joked that maybe they were after us. I'm not kidding you. The voices stopped, and the flashlights whipped in our direction. The chase was then on. As we were running back to the car, we ran out of breath near the end and walked as fast as we could to the parking lot. To see a tan truck parked next to us with binoculars on the dash. It was nearly winter, nearly dark, freezing cold, and not another soul in sight. Why the heck were these people out here, and why did they chase us? After that, I've had the worst nightmare I've ever had, and to this day, I swear it to be, as I state it here, someone else was in my dream. I've dreamt that my wife and I were staying at a haunted hotel, but then the dream suddenly stopped, and a man clipped through the floor. Only the upper part of his face would be seen through the floor, and he locked eyes with me. I then was jackknifed awake, and the words were audible in my head as I sat up in my bed shaking. "We are watching you." I am quite aware of my mental faculties, and this was not merely my nerves. I am very convinced someone else was in my dream. The research of the Stanley Cripper, Montague Ullman et al. In the books Dream Telepathy, perhaps the only viable scientific study on the phenomenon, goes a ways towards confirming this is possible. I have only once been terrified as much as that moment. We just moved all the way from the West Coast to the Midwest. We had trouble finding a place to stay since we had such a huge family. So one of our uncles let us stay in the other half of his duplex. It was a 2-story giant house. Anyway, we were the kids, playing in the basement at 1 or 2 a.m. and we see this door that we had never noticed before. We dared each other to try and open it, but no one would, since we were all scared. The next morning, we told my grandfather about the room. He goes into the basement and opens up the door, which was just a small room. But I remember it being really dark in there. The only light that came into the room were the small amounts of light from us opening the door. He takes a look into the room, and I remember him saying, "You stay right here." Not talking to me, of course. He got my father and then quickly went to the farmer's and got a chicken. My grandfather was a traditional shaman, so he respectfully gave thanks to the chicken and killed it. The chicken blood was collected into a bowl. He got the shaman hat and finger bells. He put on the hat, which covered his entire face, and proceeded to open the door. With the finger bells in one hand and the bowl of chicken blood, he goes in there and says some incantation and places the chicken blood in the room. He comes out, closes the door, and then he starts doing his chants, and you can hear the bowl moving. It had this spinning kind of sound to it, and when it finally stops, my grandfather opens the door again. As his chants get louder, it also echoes more. We weren't allowed to see what was happening in that room during the exchange, but his finger bells sounded like he was walking into a corner. He comes out with the bowl that had a small amount of chicken blood left, and what looked to be a little hand-stitched doll with red twine around it, in the blood-soaked bowl. I remember clearly the little doll was soaked in blood. He takes a match and lights the doll on fire in the bowl. He tells my father to make sure to bring it outside, and don't let the fire die out until he gets outside. I don't know how the bowl with the chicken blood was on fire. I doubt chicken blood would catch on fire, so the only thing I could think of was the doll. Once my father left, I got a look into the room, and you can faintly see that most of the chicken blood is splattered around the room. We had to clean it up later with flashlights, because the room was so dark and the blood was smeared all over the walls. A few days later, in the middle of the night, I hear my mother and father panicking. There was a ton of smoke in the house. We went out of the room to check out what was happening, and my father was running back and forth from the bathroom to get the pail of water to where the smoke was coming from. My mother grabbed all of us outside and called the fire department. We all got outside except my grandfather, who was nowhere to be found. My dad quickly ran back into the duplex, and for what seemed like hours, came out carrying my grandfather on his back. Somehow, my grandfather had his shaman hat on, which puzzled me. I asked my father a few years ago, after grandfather had passed away, about where he'd found him. My dad said the smoke was coming from near the basement. He found my grandfather in a deep trance facing a wall. He quickly got my grandfather out of the trance and carried him out. It was weird, since the firefighters said the fire must have suffocated itself to death because they couldn't find a fire at all. However, the walls in the kitchen and in the basement were all smoked afterwards. My father said a bad spirit was trapped in the room. My grandfather is the only one that knows why it was trapped in there, so I can't tell you why it happened. Was the ritual necessary? My grandfather would never do rituals unless he had to. It's been very tiring on the ancestral spirits and the body to keep doing rituals. He wouldn't do one unless he knew he had to. Spirits like these don't just go away naturally. Even today, if I were feeling ill, a shaman would most likely tell me to seek medical attention, unless my soul were missing or wounded. There's a big difference in being physically sick and having your soul wounded or missing. Me and a couple of friends live at the very edge of our neighborhood, the edge of town, and behind our houses is a seemingly endless sea of forest. I kid you not. I've walked for hours in several directions and never reached the end. On Google Maps, it may as well be a state park. Anyway, we have explored these forests countless times, and in our minds were always incredibly safe places to walk along. Some people took their dogs, other people liked to ride their bikes, others liked to hike. Everyone in the area knew this was the place to be if you wanted to go for a long walk, especially us. One afternoon, we had taken our paintball guns and gone out for a massive session down in the woods. There was a part that was quite remote, that we knew very well and often played at. This was our first time there in a few months, and after we'd finished our session, we were cooling off with a drink before making our way back, when we noticed something peculiar on the ground. It was ash, candles, and the remains of some papers. Whoever was here had left candles that had almost fully run out of wax, and just left the small little metallic containers on the ground. We looked around, quite confused. It didn't look very old, as it hadn't been covered in leaves yet, as this was the fall. We assumed this must have been only a few days old. My friends and I joked that it must be the local Satan worshippers, despite the fact that we knew nothing of the sort existed in our area. One of us then said that we should have a stakeout and see if they come back in the middle of the night. We all laughed and dismissed it, and went back home and kind of forgot about it. Well, a few months later, in the news, dogs and cats started disappearing. Our town paper was full of these reports that there were these serial pet abductors on the loose. No one really knew what was going on. Now that you're listening, you've probably pieced it together. And yep, that is exactly what happened. You heard me. It was the people, cult, Satanists, whatever you want to call them. that would meet near where we played paintball in the woods, that would take these pets and kill them. I'm not really sure what they did. I don't like to know the details. But one day, when we decided it would be time for another round of paintball, this was already about May, did we go over to our regular place and see that it had changed significantly. There were now plastic chairs, as well as a much bigger fire pit for whatever rituals they were trying to do, as well as some fresh mounds of dirt scattered along the side. Some looked like they had been trampled. We were worried and called the cops. They took a long time to get out because we were now very remote, and I heard back later that they had found the cadavers and skeletons and charred remains of pets. These cult members had taken these pets, abducted them from front lawns or whatever, and set them on fire, or slit their throats and used their blood. This is just speculation now. I truly don't know what went on, as I was spared the details. But it certainly creeped us out. Safe to say, we strayed from those woods for a while, and we found another place to play paintball. I think it's better that way. I don't think they ever caught the cultists. Maybe we should have done that stakeout after all. I lived in a very quiet rural town when I was younger. There was only one stoplight, a Safeway, and one gas station, with little mom and pop shops in between. I lived 35 minutes out of town, on a street with only 5 other people on it, all a good walking distance away from each other, meaning you couldn't see your neighbours out your window. It was only 10 or 12 at the time, and my older brother, who had recently got his license, wanted any excuse to take the car out, and me being an annoying little sister, always begged to tag along. I can't remember what we had done, but it was 11:30 at night, and we had just turned on our long winding street. I lived in the Pacific Northwest, so the pine trees tower over you, and can sometimes give you the feeling of being enclosed. And it was a particularly foggy night, so visibility was limited. I was looking towards my brother from the passenger seat, not paying attention to the road at all, when all of a sudden, my brother slams on his brakes hard enough that I nearly hit the dashboard. I had my mouth open, about to yell at him, when I see his face is petrified, with an expression I couldn't pinpoint. His lips were pinched together, nostrils flaring, and I could hear his breathing. His eyes wide open and locked on like a missile to its target. I finally allow my eyes to follow his gaze. In the middle of the street, low fog on the road, were 2 individuals in black robes with their hoodies on. These robes were the real thing, just like the Grim Reapers, wider at the opening of the sleeves, and the hood completely covered their faces, so we couldn't see anything. We sit there for what felt like forever, just staring at them in our headlights, and then they start to walk towards us. At this point, my scared shitless little self had both hands on my brother's, shaking his arms violently, back and forth, screaming. "Lock the doors, lock the doors!" he cried out. I am! And pressing the lock button, we hear the reassuring sound. These people were crawling towards the car, in perfect sync, stepping slowly at the same time. We watched them as they made their way to the front of the car, and then make the slight turn so they began walking by the driver's side. My brother and I were stuck in fear, just staring as they walked past us and disappeared into the dark of our rearview mirror. We sped home and freaked out, telling our dad everything, who then called the cops, who reported multiple sightings of these two and then instructed us not to confront them. We never heard or saw anything about them again. But creepy cult members, I hope we do not meet again. I grew up on Guam and attended Harvest Christian Academy, Baptist, from kinder till middle school. My goodness, it was hell. At the time I couldn't see it because I was so brainwashed, but the whole school community was a cult. They brainwashed and forced Christianity onto students constantly, and if you didn't convert, you were segregated from the community. As a Christian school, I would understand that you would want to influence students to your religion, but no way should students feel left out because they have their own set of beliefs. Other really odd things they made me believe was wearing too short of a skirt or shorts was sinful and ungodly, because we were allowing Satan to control our body, to manipulate the mind of our peers. They even made us believe that watching movies that were not rated PG are sinful, and I should stay away from them. Pop culture and music was also not accepted and were banned ungodly. They went as far as saying that students, mind you I was in kindergarten when this rule was enacted, can't bring items with characters such as Pokemon, Powerpuff Girls and Harry Potter, because they are depicted with superpowers that only God can have, and thus it is unholy. The hardest thing to do was finally growing up and realizing how much bullshit was being fed to me and begging my parents to get me the hell out of there. After leaving, I faced repercussions of old friends turning their backs on me and teachers looking down and shaming me. Overall, it was a terrible, terrible situation, and I'm so glad I left that place to experience a better high school. Sad thing is that most of my friends I grew up with that graduated from that school still hold the same outlook on life and are still very much involved in the school and its community. I was in 7th or 8th grade when me and about 15 of my friends and acquaintances went into the woods by the highway. To ensure that no one saw that there were kids with airsoft guns and camos shooting each other, we trekked deep into the woods. No highway car could be heard, so we knew it was far enough. We eventually came across this old single-roomed house. The windows were boarded up with wood, and the door had about 5 padlocks, and the pool out the back was green with algae. Grass overgrew any remnants of a driveway through the dense forest. Peeking through the wood boards, we found broken furniture and the floor caked in dirt. The guy who organized the hangout lived nearby and assured us that the owners hadn't been at the house for 10 years. They were old and presumed dead. With no concerns, we finally played airsoft for a few hours. Needing a break, we rendezvoused back at the house. As we approached, we could hear this faint sound of an engine. Nobody could even tell the car was approaching at first because of the thick brush. Sure enough, a black car was rolling around the corner. Pulling up to our group, the driver lowers the passenger window. An old man driving an old man behind him. The passenger was an elderly woman with another elderly woman behind her. Everyone in the car was dressed in all black formal clothes. They practically started screaming at us to get away, literally almost shrieking, but it also sounded angry. We tried to apologize for trespassing, but the driver started reaching for something in the glove box and we all ran out of there. Their eyes were so greyish blue, it was almost transparent. Their hair was whiter than snow. The black tuxedos and dresses were vampiric looking. To this day, I think they were cultists. I'll never know, and I shall never forget. I grew up in your basic non-denominational Christian household, both parents being devout, but not overly obsessive, so this is where things took a turn. My dad brought my older brother and I to this evening church service at a new location. I remember thinking it odd, even at the age of 7, that this church was being held in a dimly lit single-floor office complex. On arrival, my father brought us forward to meet the pastor and have him pray over us. This man stood over my brother and I, laid his hand on our head, and started speaking in tongues. I know some sects of Christianity do this. Yet, while he would do so, the whole room of men and women began to do the same, some falling on the floor in seizure-like fits. When the pastor finished his chanting, he spoke to my father and told him that he saw our future from God, and if we remained loyal, we would do whatever we wished. He then condemned us from having any toys, because now that we have been seen by God, the devil would use our toys to carry demons. That night, my dad threw away all of our toys and told us how he saw a man's face turn lizard that night, and we must rid ourselves of demons. The only thing that saved my brother and I from going back was my mother hearing this and forbidding us from ever visiting again. Though my parents separated, I do believe my father returned numerous times to this church, yet he now lives in a home, doped up on many mind-numbing medications. I visited a friend in Miami back in the 80s. There were 3 of us, and we decided to drop acid and go for a hike in the swamp. We saw many wonderful and strange things, like banana spiders, huge things with massive webs, almost walked face first into one, and all kinds of animals. We reached this quiet part of the swamp where it was darker and the ground was hard-packed black mud with little holes filled with swamp water. There was a clearing in the mud, and a long black wooden dock was built on top of the mud, which ended in like a wooden deck/altar setup. The whole dock was painted in strange white symbols or runes. We were climbing around on it, just trying to convince ourselves that it was real. Silently, out the swamp, about 3 dozen raccoons wandered towards us, completely unafraid. They were dipping their hands in the holes, I guess searching for food. They surrounded us on the dock and passed around and under us in about 10 minutes. There was a lot. They looked at us curiously and kept on moving. I walked to the entrance of the docks and turned around, looking down the dock at exactly the right angle. The white paint symbols connected in perspective of the railing, slates, and wooden decks of the dock to form a huge satanic goat head, the kind you might find in a book of the occult. I showed my buddies, and we got real quiet and moved away from the area. We spent the rest of the trip on the beach surrounded by people and life. I have no idea what the dock was for, and I'm not sure I want to know. I went turkey hunting with my dad in the Shawnee National Forest several years ago. I was about 10. We took one afternoon to hike and scout hunting spots. Along the trail, we saw a few blood spatters and drips. Not a big deal, it's nature. About a quarter of a mile up the trail, however, we come up to 3 dogs hanging from a tree, gutted, bled out, and skinned. Okay, now that was pretty weird and scary. We keep going a bit further, as there was a bluff not too far away that was pretty cool to look at. We come to the bluff and find weird symbols burned in the ground and on the side of the rock wall. Candle wax, absolutely everywhere, and more blood all over the ground. By that time my dad, whom I've never seen scared in my life, looked at me and said, "Let's go." And we took off at a pretty big pace back to the camp. The worst part is that we didn't leave the campsite that night, so I laid awake in the camper freaking out at every sound I heard. I still get goosebumps thinking about that event to this day.